The projector carousel clicked, a mechanical heartbeat in the silence of the briefing room, followed by the hum of the cooling fan fighting the stagnant, smoke-heavy air. On the screen, a grainy, high-contrast black and white photograph flickered into existence. It showed a shape that defied every known principle of aeronautical engineering, a jagged, faceted pyramid with wings, sitting on a sun-bleached tarmac in the Nevada desert. It looked less like a weapon of war and more like a child's origami project crushed under a heavy boot. General Anatoly Volkov, a man whose chest bore the weight of 3 decades of Cold War doctrine, leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his shifting weight. He took a long drag from an unfiltered cigarette, the ember glowing angrily in the dim light, and exhaled a plume of blue smoke that drifted toward the projected image. "This," the intelligence officer stammered, tapping the screen with a trembling pointer, "is what the Americans are calling senior trend. The rumors suggest it is invisible to radar." For a moment, the room was silent, save for the electrical buzz of the overhead fluorescent tubes. Then, a low rumble began in Volkov's chest. It started as a chuckle, dry and dismissive, before erupting into a full-bellied laugh that echoed off the concrete walls of the GRU headquarters. The other officers, sensing the cue, joined in, a chorus of professional disdain filling the room. Invisible? Volkov wiped a tear from his eye, gesturing at the screen with his cigarette. "Look at it, comrades. It has the aerodynamics of a brick. It has no curves. It has no grace. If that thing can fly, then my desk can fly. They are trying to scare us with geometry. They are trying to bankrupt us with a ghost story." He stood up, walking to the screen and placing a heavy hand on the projected image, his shadow swallowing the strange aircraft. Let them build their toys. Let them waste their billions on jagged edges and black paint. Physics is not a capitalist invention. A radar wave is a physical constant. It bounces, it returns, and when it does, our S-300s will turn this diamond into scrap metal before the pilot even knows he is dead. The laughter resumed, louder this time, fueled by the comforting certainty of their own superiority. They were the masters of the sky. They had built the most dense, sophisticated, and lethal air defense network in human history. The idea that a single subsonic, unstable aircraft could penetrate the red shield was not just unlikely, it was a mathematical impossibility. But deep in the circuitry of the American defense industry, a clock was ticking that General Volkov could not hear. A shift was occurring that would not only prove him wrong, but would dismantle the entire philosophical foundation of Soviet military power. Before the decade was out, the laughter in this room would be replaced by a silence so profound it would signal the end of an era. The story of how the Soviet command went from mocking a grainy photograph to watching their entire strategic paradigm evaporate. In a Single Night is not just a story about a plane. It is a story about the danger of arrogance, the blindness of expertise, and the terrifying effectiveness of a weapon that fights not with speed or armor, but with the weaponized absence of information. If you want to understand the future of warfare, you must first understand the night the radar screens went blank and the world changed forever. To understand the magnitude of the Soviet mistake, we must first conduct an autopsy of their confidence. This was not the bluster of amateurs. It was the calculated certainty of professionals who had spent 40 years perfecting the art of denial. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union and its client states did not just have air defenses, they had an integrated, multi-layered ecosystem of denial that covered half the globe. This was the Red Shield. It was a doctrine of overlapping lethality. At the outer rim, you had the massive, long-range early warning radars, the tall kings and spoon rests, churning out megawatts of electromagnetic energy, sweeping the horizon like the eye of Sauron. Inside that, you had the area denial systems, the S-200s and S-75s, missiles the size of telephone poles designed to swat B-52 bombers out of the stratosphere. And at the core, protecting the critical targets were the point defense systems, the S-125s, the Cubs, and the Shilkas, a hornet's nest of rapid-fire cannons and maneuverable missiles. The philosophy was simple: mass, redundancy, brutality. If you launch enough radar waves, you will get a return. If you fire enough missiles, you will get a kill. It was a system built on the laws of probability and the brute force of physics. Every aircraft is made of metal. Every aircraft has engines that spin and heat up. Every aircraft has a shape. Therefore, every aircraft can be seen, tracked, and destroyed. This belief was absolute. It was taught in the academies in Moscow. It was exported to Hanoi, to Cairo, and, most fatally, to Baghdad. In 1990, Baghdad was not just a city, it was a fortress. Under the guidance of Soviet advisors, the Iraqi regime had constructed an air defense network known as CARI, the French acronym for Iraq spelled backward. It was a masterpiece of integrated defense, a localized version of the Red Shield that General Volkov and his staff were so proud of. It connected hundreds of radar sites, missile batteries, and interceptor squadrons into a single computerized nervous system buried deep in hardened bunkers. The Soviet advisors in Baghdad looked at CARI and nodded in approval. They told their Iraqi counterparts that the airspace over Baghdad was impenetrable. They calculated the kill zones. They ran the simulations. They laughed at the reports of the strange black jets the Americans were deploying to the remote airfields of Saudi Arabia. "Let them come," the advisors said. "We will see them on the P-18 radars at 200 kilometers. We will hand them off to the S-125s at 40 kilometers. We will kill them at 20 kilometers. It is a mathematical certainty." But while the Soviets were worshipping the altar of mass and power, a small group of engineers at the Lockheed Skunk Works in California had been worshipping a different god: the equation. The irony, one that would haunt the halls of the Kremlin for decades, was that the seed of their destruction had come from their own garden. Decades earlier, a Russian physicist named Pyotr Ufimtsev had published a dense, obscure paper titled Method of Edge Waves in the Physical Theory of Diffraction. It was a dry, academic exploration of how electromagnetic waves scatter off two-dimensional shapes. The Soviet censors had reviewed it, yawned, and cleared it for open publication. To them, it was useless theory. It suggested that the radar cross-section of an object didn't depend on its size, but on its edge configuration. But the calculations required to apply this theory to a real aircraft was so complex, so computationally expensive, that they believed it was impossible to build a plane based on them. It would be aerodynamically unstable. It would fall out of the sky. They were right about the instability, but they were wrong about the computers. The Americans found the paper, they translated it, and unlike the Soviet generals, they didn't laugh. They saw the ghost hidden in the math. They realized that if you built a plane entirely out of flat surfaces, facets, arranged in a very specific way, you could deflect the radar energy away from the receiver. You wouldn't be invisible to the wave, but you would be invisible to the eye, looking for the return. The result was the F-117 Nighthawk, the hopeless diamond. It was a technological paradox. It was a plane that shouldn't fly, kept in the air by quadruple redundant flight computers making thousands of micro-adjustments per second. It was subsonic. It had no radar of its own to hunt targets. It carried no defensive guns. It had no afterburners. It was a pure, distilled expression of a single idea. If they can't see you, they can't kill you. But stealth is a word that marketing teams use. The pilots and engineers preferred low observable. They knew the physics. They knew that the F-117 wasn't magic. If a pilot banked the wrong way, presenting the flat bottom of the jet to a radar emitter, he would bloom on the screen like a supernova. If he opened the bomb bay doors for too long, the radar waves would bounce around the internal cavity and scream his location to the enemy. It was a high-wire act performed in total darkness. The pilots were not fighter jocks in the traditional sense. They were system managers, flying a precise, pre-calculated path through the mathematical gaps in the enemy's vision. They were ghosts, but ghosts that could bleed. January 16, 1991. The sun dipped below the horizon in the Arabian Peninsula, and the sky turned a bruised purple. On the tarmac of a secret airbase, the angular shadows of the F-117s lengthened until they merged with the coming night. The pilots climbed the ladders, their movements stiff in their G-suits. There was no banter, no Top Gun posturing, just the cold metallic taste of adrenaline and the rhythmic hiss of oxygen regulators. They were about to do something that military history said was suicide. They were going to fly into the heart of the most heavily defended city on Earth alone. No jamming support, no fighter escorts. Just them, the math, and the darkness. In the command bunkers of Baghdad, the mood was tense but confident. The screens of the Kari system glowed with the green amber of the search radars. The operators sat in their swivel chairs, headsets on, listening to the static, waiting for the telltale blip that would signal the start of the American attack. The Soviet advisors stood behind them, arms crossed, watching the displays. They checked the status of the missile batteries. Green lights across the board. The S-125s were spooled up. The Rolands were active. The AAA, anti-aircraft artillery, crews were at their guns, scanning the night sky. The Americans rely on their jammers, a Soviet colonel remarked to an Iraqi general. They will try to blind us with noise, but our frequency agility is superior. We will burn through their jamming. We will see them. The clock ticked past midnight. 2:00 a.m. 2:30 a.m. The radar screens remained clear. The sweep arms rotated, once, twice, 100 times, painting nothing but the empty noise of the atmosphere. High above, at 15,000 feet, the first wave of F-117s crossed the border. Inside the cockpit of the lead jet, the pilot watched his displays. He could see the threats. His ARD-Bluar radar warning receiver was lighting up with the electronic signatures of the enemy radars. He was flying through a soup of electromagnetic energy. He was being painted by a dozen different systems. By all the laws of warfare he had grown up with, he should be dead. The alarms should be screaming. The sky should be filled with the smoke trails of SAMs. But there was nothing. He looked down at his sensor display. The infrared camera showed the city of Baghdad glowing like a circuit board in the desert night. The lights were on. The street lamps were burning. The enemy had no idea he was there. He was a ghost in their machine. The pilot checked his timing. The mission was choreographed to the second. He wasn't just flying a plane, he was executing a logic gate in a massive, lethal program. Target acquired, he whispered to himself, though his radio was silent. He aligned the crosshairs on the roof of the main telecommunications center in downtown Baghdad, the brain of the Kari system. He waited for the release cue. 3, 2, 1. The bomb bay doors snapped open. A single GBU-27 laser-guided bomb dropped into the slipstream. The doors snapped shut immediately, restoring the aircraft's stealth geometry. For the radar operators below, the brief opening of the doors might have caused a momentary flicker, a ghost return that appeared for a second and then vanished. A glitch, a bird, an atmospheric anomaly. They ignored it. The bomb fell silently, riding the laser beam like a train on a track. It didn't just hit the building, it threaded the needle. It punched through the reinforced concrete roof, penetrated 4 floors of hardened bunker, and detonated in the server room. The explosion didn't just destroy a building, it lobotomized the enemy. In the bunker, the screens flickered, the data links severed, the voice channels dissolved into static. "What was that?" the Iraqi general shouted, reaching for a phone that was already dead. "We have no tracks," The radar operator screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "There is nothing on the scope." Then the second bomb hit. Then the third. Across Baghdad, the critical nodes of the air defense network began to erupt in fireballs. The AT&T building, the presidential palace, the sector operations centers. The city exploded into chaos. The anti-aircraft gunners, blind and terrified, began to fire wildly into the sky. Tracers arced into the night, a curtain of lead and fire. It was a spectacular, terrifying display of lethal power, and it was completely useless. The F-117s were flying above the tracers, watching the fireworks show with cold detachment. They were untouched. They were untouchable. The Soviet advisors watched in horror. This was not supposed to happen. The doctrine said that to attack a target like this, you needed mass. You needed waves of bombers. You needed hundreds of escort fighters. You needed a brute force assault that would result in 10, maybe 15% losses. Instead, they were watching a systematic execution. The Americans were dismantling the grid from the inside out, surgically removing the eyes and ears of the defense, and the defense couldn't even see the knife. The ghost effect had taken hold. The psychological impact was more devastating than the explosives. The Iraqi operators stopped trusting their equipment. If the radar says the sky is clear, but the building next door just exploded, then the radar is lying. If the radar is lying, then the system is broken. If the system is broken, then we are defenseless. Panic is a contagion, and that night, it spread through the Iraqi military at the speed of light. They turned off their radars to avoid the anti-radiation missiles that followed the F-117s. They abandoned their posts. They fired blindly at the moon. By the time the sun rose over Baghdad, the Kari system was effectively dead. The impenetrable fortress had been breached, sacked, and burned, not by a horde of barbarians, but by a handful of geometric shapes that whispered through the dark. The statistics that emerged from that conflict were not just numbers, they were an indictment of an entire military philosophy. In the first 24 hours of the air war, the F-117s flew only 2% of the combat sorties, a tiny fraction of the total force, yet they struck over 40% of the strategic targets. But here is the statistic that caused the blood to drain from the faces of the generals in Moscow. Sorties flown by F-117s over Baghdad, over 1,200. Aircraft lost to enemy fire, 0. Against the densest air defense network outside of the Soviet Union itself. Against the best technology the Eastern Bloc had to offer. Against the doctrine of mass and redundancy. The score was geometry, 1,200. Physics of the old world, 0. Back in Moscow, the laughter had long since died. The reports coming in from the embassy in Baghdad were being read in a silence that was heavy and suffocating. General Volkov sat at the same desk, the same projector hum in the background. But the image on the screen was no longer a grainy photo of a toy. It was a satellite assessment of a destroyed command bunker. He looked at the hole in the roof. It was precise, surgical. There were no craters in the street, no collateral damage to the surrounding blocks, just a neat, blackened puncture wound where the brain of the defense used to be. The cigarette in his hand burned down to the filter, stinging his fingers, but he didn't notice. He was staring at the death of his worldview. The red shield was obsolete. The millions of tons of steel, the thousands of missiles, the vast networks of radar sites, they were all suddenly, terrifyingly useless. They had built a wall to stop a flood, and the Americans had invented water that could walk through stone. The Soviet command realized that they weren't just behind, they were fighting a different war entirely. They were playing checkers with heavy marble pieces, while the Americans were playing three-dimensional chess with beams of light and equations. The humiliation was total. It wasn't just that they had lost a proxy war, it was that their definition of power had been proven false. They had believed that power was visible. Big missiles, big tanks, big parades. The F-117 proved that true power in the modern age is invisible. It is the ability to strike without being seen, to know without being known, to act without reaction. This revelation didn't just end the Cold War, it shattered the psychological foundation of the Soviet military machine. The arrogance of the tangible was replaced by the paranoia of the invisible. In the years that followed, the world would see the proliferation of stealth technology. The F-22, the B-2, the J-20. The shapes would change, the curves would return as computing power improved, but the lesson of that night in Baghdad remained the cornerstone of modern warfare. But we must return to that briefing room in Moscow, to the moment of the laugh. It is easy to mock what we do not understand. It is human nature to dismiss the anomaly, to cling to the comfortable rules of the past. The Soviet generals laughed because the F-117 looked wrong. It didn't look like a fighter, it didn't look like a weapon, it looked like a mistake. They forgot the oldest rule of innovation. The next revolution never looks like the last one. It always looks like a toy. It always looks like a joke. Until it wakes you up in the middle of the night and you realize the roof is gone, the screen is blank, and the world you thought you owned has already moved on without you. The F-117 Nighthawk was eventually retired, its jagged facets replaced by smoother, more organic shapes. But its legacy is not in a museum. Its legacy is in the silence of that briefing room. It is the ghost that still haunts every radar operator who stares at a green sweep arm and wonders, is the sky really empty? Or am I just looking at the world with old eyes? The arrogance of the known was destroyed by the geometry of the unknown. And in the silence that followed, a new truth was born. In the age of information warfare, what you can't see doesn't just hurt you, it makes you irrelevant. The story of the F-117 is not just a chapter in a history book. It is a warning to any system, any institution, any leader who believes that past success guarantees future safety. The moment you laugh at the toy that defies your rules, you have already lost. The ghost is already in the room. You just haven't seen it yet. To fully grasp the anatomy of this systemic failure, we need to zoom in. We need to look past the generals and the politicians and look at the raw engineering of the conflict. This was a war of wavelengths. Radar, radio detection, and ranging works on a principle of echo. You shout into a canyon and the sound comes back. The time it takes tells you the distance. The pitch tells you the speed. Doppler shift. The volume of the echo tells you the size. For 50 years, the Soviet approach to defeating aircraft was to build ears that were more sensitive and shouts that were louder. They built radars that operated in every band of the spectrum. High-frequency X-band for targeting precision. Low-frequency VHF for long-range detection. They believed that by flooding the sky with every flavor of electromagnetic energy, nothing could hide. And they were right, against metal tubes with vertical tails. A standard fighter jet, like an F-15 or a MiG-29, is a radar reflector's dream. It has air intakes that act like resonant cavities, bouncing waves back with intensified strength. It has a vertical stabilizer that acts like a corner reflector, sending the signal straight back to the source. From a radar perspective, an F-15 is not a plane. It is a flying barn door. The F-117 was the anti-barn door. The engineers at Skunk Works, led by the legendary Ben Rich, had to solve a problem that seemed physically impossible. How do you make a 30-ton aircraft look like a bird, or better yet, a marble? The solution lay in the two variables we mentioned earlier, materials and geometry. First, the materials. The F-117 was coated in a classified substance known as RAM, radar-absorbent material. It was a dense magnetic paint that worked like a sponge for radio waves. When a radar pulse hit the skin of the jet, instead of bouncing off, a portion of the energy was absorbed and converted into heat. It was the electromagnetic equivalent of painting a flashlight black. But paint alone wasn't enough. You can't paint a barn door black and expect it to disappear in a searchlight. You need to change the shape. This is where the geometry, the faceting, came in. And this is where the Soviet laughter was most misplaced. The jagged, ugly shape of the F-117 was not an aesthetic failure, it was a mathematical triumph. Every flat panel on the aircraft was angled specifically to reflect radar waves away from the source. If a radar beam hit the side of the jet, the panel would bounce it up into space or down into the ground, anywhere but back to the receiver. Imagine trying to shine a flashlight into a room full of mirrors. If the mirrors are flat and facing you, the light bounces back and blinds you. But if every mirror is angled at 45 degrees, the light bounces away and the room appears dark. The F-117 was a flying room of angled mirrors. But this created a new problem, a nightmare problem. Aerodynamics hates sharp angles. Air likes to flow over smooth curves. When you force air over sharp edges, it becomes turbulent. It creates drag. It creates instability. The F-117 was naturally unstable. It wanted to flip over. It wanted to spin. It wanted to fall. To keep it in the air, the Americans had to develop a fly-by-wire system of unprecedented complexity. The pilot stick wasn't connected to the flaps and rudders by cables. It was connected to a computer. When the pilot pulled back on the stick, he was telling the computer, "I would like to go up." The computer would then calculate the thousands of adjustments needed to the control surfaces to achieve that outcome without tumbling the aircraft out of the sky. The Soviet engineers knew about fly-by-wire. They used it too. But they didn't believe you could rely on it to keep a brick in the air during combat. They trusted the airframe first, the computer second. The Americans flipped the script. They trusted the computer to conquer the airframe. This was the fundamental divergence. The Soviets trusted physics, aerodynamics. The Americans trusted code, digital control. And in the skies over Baghdad, code won. Let's go back to the cockpit on that first night. The sensory experience of the pilot is critical to understanding the tension. Major Al Whitley, flying one of the lead jets, described the environment as claustrophobic and electric. The cockpit of the F-117 is tight. The windows are small and treated with gold film to prevent radar waves from entering the cockpit and bouncing off the pilot's helmet. The view outside is limited. You are flying on instruments. You are flying on trust. As Whitley approached the border, he turned off all his emitters. No radar, no radio, no transponder. He was emission silent. To the electronic world, he had ceased to exist. But he wasn't blind. He had a secret weapon. FLIR, forward-looking infrared, and DLIR, downward-looking infrared. These were passive sensors. They didn't send out a signal. They just collected the heat signatures of the world below. On his screen, the desert was a cool gray. The engines of trucks were hot white dots. The buildings of Baghdad were geometric blocks of warmth. He could see the enemy. He could see the S-125 batteries rotating, searching for him. He could see the AAA pits. It was like walking through a room full of sleeping tigers, knowing that if you stepped on a single twig, they would all wake up at once. The discipline required was inhuman. When the radar warning receiver chirped, indicating a search radar was sweeping him, every instinct in a fighter pilot's brain screams, "Evasiveness, turn, drop chaff, light the afterburners." But Whitley did none of that. He held his course. He trusted the math. He knew that the radar beam was hitting his faceted skin and bouncing harmlessly into the stratosphere. He knew that to the operator below, he was nothing more than a patch of empty sky. This discipline, the discipline to do nothing in the face of death, was the human variable that the Soviets had not accounted for. They assumed American pilots were cowboys, reliant on speed and aggression. They didn't anticipate a pilot who would fly straight and level into the teeth of a dragon, armed only with a geometry textbook. The impact of the first strike cannot be overstated. When the Kari system went down, it didn't just blind the defense, it severed the command chain. The Iraqi air defense was a centralized Soviet-style hierarchy. Decisions were made at the top. Target tracks were correlated at the Sector Operations Centers, SOCs, and then passed down to the batteries. The local battery commanders had very little autonomy. They were trained to wait for orders. When the SOCs were destroyed in the first minutes of the war, the brain was cut off from the body. The battery commanders were left in the dark, staring at blank screens, with no orders coming down the line. Confusion turned to paralysis. Paralysis turned to panic. Some commanders turned on their radars autonomously, desperate to see something. But the moment they lit up, they became beacons for the wild weasels, the F-4Gs and FA-18s trailing behind the stealth wave, armed with HARM, high-speed anti-radiation missiles. It was a perfect trap. If you stay off, the F-117s bomb you. If you turn on, the HARMs kill you. The Soviet advisors watched this dilemma unfold with a growing sense of nausea. Their doctrine had no answer for this. Their manuals assumed a linear fight. Enemy planes appear, we track them, we shoot them. They had no chapter for the enemy is here, but we cannot see them, and our command center is a smoking crater. The killer. Humbling moment came not with a bang, but with a whisper. It was a specific strike on the Iraqi Air Force headquarters. The building was deeply buried, heavily fortified. The Soviets had assured the Iraqis it was nuclear-proof. An F-117 glided over the city. It dropped a bunker buster, a hardened penetrator bomb. The bomb hit the ventilation shaft. It was a shot 1 in a million, or so it seemed. In reality, it was a shot 1 in 1. The laser guidance was that precise. The bomb plunged down the shaft, deep into the earth, and detonated inside the bunker. The building imploded. The nuclear-proof fortress was gutted from the inside. The footage of this strike was broadcast on CNN. The world saw it. The Soviet General Staff saw it. It was the moment the 20th century of warfare ended and the 21st began. The image of the crosshairs, the silent drop, the implosion. It was a demonstration of dominance so absolute that it made the massive tank armies of the Cold War look like relics of the Bronze Age. The psychological ripple effect was immediate. In Moscow, the procurement plans for the next decade were quietly shredded. The massive investment in upgrading the S-200 and S-300 systems was paused. Panic meetings were held. "How do we see the invisible?" they asked. They began to look for counters. They looked at long-wavelength radars, VHF, which are harder to stealth against because the wavelength is close to the size of the aircraft's features. They looked at bistatic radars, where the transmitter and receiver are in different places. They looked at infrared search and track, IRST. They weren't wrong. Stealth is not invincibility. It is physics. And physics can be beaten by other physics. In 1999, over Serbia, an F-117 would be shot down by a clever Serbian commander using an ancient S-125 system, modified to operate on long wavelengths, and, crucially, knowing exactly when the bomb bay doors would open. But that was the exception that proved the rule. And it happened almost a decade later. In 1991, the shock was total. The F-117 didn't just win the war, it saved lives. Not just American lives, but Iraqi lives. Because the strikes were so precise, the coalition didn't have to carpet bomb the city. They didn't have to level entire grids to take out a single node. The surgical nature of the war, while often exaggerated by media, was a reality compared to the indiscriminate destruction of Dabei Tunzund or Vietnam. But for the Soviet command, the humanitarian aspect was secondary to the strategic catastrophe. They had spent 40 years preparing for World War III in Europe. They had built thousands of tanks, thousands of MiGs, thousands of SAMs. They assumed the war would be a meat grinder, a clash of titans. The F-117 showed them that the next war would not be a wrestling match, it would be an assassination. It would be over before the victim knew the fight had started. The ghost had walked through the wall and the wall had crumbled. let's return to the philosophical dimension. The laughter of General Volkov was rooted in a specific worldview: materialism. The belief that what matters is matter: steel, concrete, explosives. The F-117 represented a shift to a new worldview: informationism. The belief that what matters is data, geometry, timing, precision. The Soviet Union collapsed later that year, in December 1991. There were many reasons: economic, political, social, but one cannot ignore the military dimension. A superpower maintains its legitimacy through the projection of power. When that power is revealed to be hollow, when its invincible shields are shown to be paper tigers, the legitimacy cracks. The F-117 didn't destroy the Soviet Union, but it destroyed the illusion of Soviet military parity. It showed the Politburo that they were bankrupt not just in rubles, but in ideas. The hopeless diamond was the ultimate capitalist weapon. It was expensive, fragile, high maintenance, and utterly reliant on advanced microchips. It was everything the Soviets despised, and it worked perfectly. As we close the dossier on this event, we are left with the image of the desert at dawn. The smoke rising from the blackened bunkers of Baghdad, the sky clear and blue, and somewhere in that sky, the faint, shimmering distortion of heat from an exhaust port, moving silently away, back to the shadows. The laughter in the briefing room is gone. It has been replaced by the hum of cooling fans in server farms, the quiet tapping of keyboards, and the silent vigil of algorithms. The lesson is etched into the history of warfare. Do not judge a weapon by how it looks, judge it by what it makes obsolete. The F-117 was a jagged, ugly, unstable thing. It was a mockery of traditional aviation, and it was the most beautiful thing the US Air Force ever flew because it was the physical embodiment of a new idea. The idea that you don't have to be stronger than your enemy. You don't have to be faster, you just have to be where they are not looking. The Soviet command laughed at the ghost, and the ghost ate them alive.